Hello and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. On April 23rd, 2025, the President of the United States issued an order on education. It includes a provision to investigate and, if necessary, terminate the credentialing authority of two organizations that credential medical schools and medical residencies. And further, it urged the Secretary of Education to resume recognizing new agencies to credential medical schools and residencies in the future. Honestly, Saul, we had a great podcast planned for today that had nothing to do with politics or current events. So why are we doing this again?
So I think what tipped me, Stefan, in favor of focusing on this yet again, as you know, last episode, which seems like a couple weeks ago, was on physicians and authoritarianism. And the subtitle was, Are We Too Obedient? One of the things we talked about in that episode is that to understand what's happening in this country, you have to see the forest and not just the trees. And we talked about some of the leading scholars of authoritarianism. And again, I use the word fascism. It wasn't just my idea to use that term. We talked about key scholars who've been talking about the direction and pattern that leads to fascism and how so many of those cookbook processes are occurring in this country. But what tipped me to bring this back for another episode is I was just listening to an interview with Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate of peace, who we talked about again on our last episode, who has played an incredible role in fighting the authoritarian system in the Philippines with Duterte and has been quite successful. She has faced enormous risk on her life. In fact, her courage is almost unimaginable. And she's kind of been a student of authoritarianism around the world. And she is basically saying this is like a 5 or 6 or 7 alarm fire here in the United States right now. And one of the things that she's pointed out is that the process of moving towards authoritarianism is occurring much more rapidly in the United States than she's seen or expected. And she quoted an organization called the VDAM Institute that is based in Sweden. It's kind of the gold standard for tracking countries' movement to or away from authoritarianism. And she was recently at a conference with the head of this organization, Stefan Lindberg, I think is his name. And what he said, which I thought was really chilling, and again, this is not a partisan. This is somebody who's dedicated their life to basically the scholarly study of the processes of moving towards or away from authoritarianism. And he said, quote, "At the pace at which it is happening, if this continues, I would say that before the end of the summer, you no longer qualify as a democracy in the United States." And he goes on to say, it would mean that the rule of law, the constraints of the executive, critically, that they would be gone to such an extent that we can no longer talk about even a constitutional republic. And again, he's saying by this summer. And so when this executive order came out that you just read, which included, by the way, not you focused on the medical piece of it. It also addressed some of the other accreditors.
Every kind of school.
Yeah. But they named the LCME and they named the ACGME. It fits that pattern. And so I think it's really critical we talk about it. And again, the other thing that I know both of us were alarmed by has been the attack on medical journals. It started with the journal Chest. And then just in the last few days, a letter went to a whole bunch of other journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine.
And we're going to get to that.
And we're going to get to that. Yeah. So I think those are going to be the two things we want to talk about because they've happened very, very recently. And the point I want to make is they all fit into this authoritarian playbook. And I think it's so important to emphasize that because one of the things we're going to do today, I think, is get into the weeds. Because one of the things I found about this whole process is the reason these authoritarians are so effective is that they're able to hone in on legitimate arguments that are occurring within these narrow domains. So, for example, there are always going to be legitimate arguments about, is the LCME good? Is it bad? Is it too focused on diversity? Too little focused on diversity? In the same way, there are discussions about, Columbia University. Is there anti-Semitism there? Well, yes, of course there is. But on the other hand, does that mean that you should, destroy the university? And so I think one of the things that's important to understand is that we live in we've been living in a democracy. And in democracies, there's always going to be raucous debate and disagreement. And I think there should be, yeah. And so I think one of the big mistakes is to be essentially suckered into thinking that because, say, the president is coming and raising what you believe are legitimate concerns about an accreditor or about a journal, that that's a reason to be on the side of the authoritarian.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big picture that I want to keep coming back to. But I still agree that, it's fair for us to get into the specifics.
Right. In order to understand this issue, we're going to have to dive right into the specific claims that are made in the presidential order and claims that are made by the people who inform that order. And I have something of a job here, which is to try to state what those claims are and state how they came to be. And then we can interrogate those claims and ask ourselves, is it true? Is it true that the entities that credential medical schools are basically uh, driving a left wing school bus that promotes politics at every turn and squelches academic excellence at every turn? Is that true? Is that legitimate claim? And some of those claims feature in the president's orders themselves. So is it okay with you if I just read a little bit of the president's order and then turn to others who have made that argument? Is that fair?
Yeah, no, please do.
Okay, so within the order that was issued on April 23rd, there's reference to how much money is spent by the federal government in support of student loans and other things like that. There's a general statement that not everybody gets a good return on their education. And then it says accreditors have remained improperly focused on compelling adoption of discriminatory ideology rather than on student outcomes. Some accreditors make the adoption of unlawfully discriminatory practices a formal standard of accreditation and therefore a condition of accessing federal aids through, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI based standards of accreditation. Then they name the ones lower down related to our work in medicine and how we create better doctors. So the Liaison Committee on Medical Education, which we call LCME, is the only federally recognized body that accredits Doctor of Medicine degree programs. And they require that institutions, quote, engage in ongoing, systematic, and focused recruitment and retention activities to achieve mission appropriate diversity outcomes among its students, close quote. That's for medical schools. Now on to residencies. The Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, the sole accreditor for both allopathic and osteopathic medical residencies and fellowships, quote, and they're quoting from a document from that organization, expects institutions to focus on implementing policies and procedures related to recruitment and retention of individuals underrepresented in medicine, including, quote, racial and ethnic minority individuals. So for this order, those are the fighting words. That's the indictment. That is what they are charged with having done. And that is why the president's order asserts that it is angry. So we need to dig into that a little bit, don't you think?
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, to my mind, the mere word diversity doesn't normally trigger in me the sense that something terrible is happening. So I had to kind of refer and look for potential ammo that would have informed this order, that would have led to this order. And I wound up paying attention to an organization that has a strong online presence and some support amongst physicians called Do No Harm. And they have a report, and they actually indict the body that credentials medical school called the LCME. And they say the same thing, that in the standards that they published for 2025-26, I mean, look, it's a very long document, but they did find a phrase that said that they should engage in systematic and focused recruitment and retention activities to achieve mission appropriate diversity outcomes. That's literally in a document they published. They also say that the LCME argues that, quote, having medical students from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, racial and ethnic groups, and other life experiences can enhance the quality and content of interactions in medical school. They find that to be pretty outrageous. And so I pulled open the LCME structure and functions of a medical school and how they guide medical schools when they're about to be credentialed. It's actually got 12 different standards. And indeed, amongst all those standards, one does find those words. And similarly, for the ACGME, the accrediting group for residencies, one finds in a rather long document called Common Program Requirements for July 1, 2025, and last year's as well, that they are supposed to have recruitment and retention of a diverse and inclusive workforce, and policies and procedures related to recruitment and retention of individuals underrepresented in medicine. And it's those words that they believe indict medical schools and residencies. And when I thought about it, I've talked to people, tried to understand, what makes that so bad. And the most common argument I found out there and that I've heard from colleagues and friends is that if you prioritize diversity, by definition, you're compromising the standards of academic excellence for acceptance. And that's a widespread belief. And secondarily, you may also be compromising the curriculum you deliver in the course of medical education. Does my rendition of that argument ring plausibly true as to what might be behind this order?
It's hard for me to know the motives of the people who say this stuff, so I can't really
Okay.
attempt to discern that. I think we can just start with the language first that is in these documents. As you said in the LCME document, they encourage mission appropriate diversity. And I've actually seen what the leadership at LCME has said about that on multiple occasions.
And the
In fact,
reason why you've seen it, just go ahead and tell our audience, why have you seen this so often?
well, so I was senior associate dean of education at my institution. So actually was responsible for kind of managing the LCME accreditation process for a while. So I had a very close view of what was going on. And I think, first of all, just to step back, I just have to tell you that this document is probably, to most people, a very boring document.
The LCME credentialing.
Yeah, you can Google it. You can Google it. It's the standards, the LCME standards, and it's about as far as you can get from, in my view, at least, from being a political document. It's basically a series of standards that they expect medical schools to follow, and I think there's something like roughly 93 different statements divided into 12 standards or something like that. I don't know if I exactly have the number right, but essentially it's something like, a medical school provides access to well-maintained information technology resources sufficient in scope to support its educational and other missions. Okay, so that it's that kind of thing, right? And there is this one that's buried in there, 3.3, where it refers to a medical school has effective policies and practices in place and engages in ongoing systematic and focused recruitment and retention activities to achieve mission-appropriate diversity outcomes among its students. Now, again,
What's that mean?
this particular standard has been called out. I noticed that one of the leaders of the LCME, the secretariat, had to discuss this specific sentence to Congress a few years ago and respond to 14 questions. So it's been a kind of this sore point. And I think what's really important here is it just says mission appropriate diversity. And the emphasis here is that, and she's talked about this, that there are many different types of diversity. I can tell you, for instance, that at my own institution, we've wanted to make our school more accessible to students with physical disabilities. And so we actually revised what are called our technical standards. And there have actually been a number of schools that have tried to do this. Obviously, for a long time, schools were not gender diverse. And there's been now at this point, medical schools, I think, are pretty much 50-50 for the most part. But that was obviously not true in the past. At one point, it was very skewed towards males. And obviously, there are schools that are trying to make their schools more diverse in a variety of other ways, including having a better mix of Black and white students or students from other ethnic groups that are underrepresented. And I think the point is that none of that is in the LCME document. The key here is that it's talking about mission-driven diversity. And they acknowledge that it depends on where the medical school is located, right? So a medical school located in one place is not going to probably have the same diversity goals as a medical school that's located in a different place and so forth. So I just want to emphasize that that's all that's in there in the LCME. And by the way, the next one is an anti-discrimination policy, which says a medical school has a policy in place to ensure that it does not discriminate on the basis of age, disability, gender identity, national origin, race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, or any basis protected by federal law. So I guess it raises questions for me. Why is there so much inflammatory rhetoric around this sentence? And I think it raises concerns, like what's going on behind it. And, are there motives? Are there an agenda? I mean, it's such a banal sentence tucked into this document that is.
I got to lay some meat on the bones. Then I got to say, okay, I've seen reports from journalists and also spoken to program directors, residency program directors who would say, look, in a variety of medical schools or residencies, it's entirely plausible that you would find that the statistical mean performance score of an entering resident who's U.S.-born African-American might be lower than the statistical mean score on some standardized exam for U.S.-born white residents entering to the same program or for medical students entering to the same programs. So I haven't heard program directors say that they wouldn't find that. They'd say, oh, yeah, you might well see. In fact, I'm pretty sure that you would find the statistical mean differences in test scores on entry. And I'll come back to how they talk about that. But what I hear from friends of mine who are more sympathetic to the view of this executive order would be something like, hey, if you have people coming in with lower scores on average, that means that you compromised the quality expectations of the entrants. And you're basically saying that in the service of a political and social corrective objective, you're willing to tolerate people who will become less good doctors and render less good care in the future in service of your political agenda. And that shouldn't be happening in America today. And I think that is one line of argument that I've seen and that I've heard and that I certainly see on the website Do No Harm.
Sure. So that's a really important point to address head on, and I'm glad you brought it up. I think, first of all, the notion that the gold standard for selecting who's going to be a good physician is how somebody does on a multiple choice test is such an impoverished view of what a physician is and what it takes to be a physician. And now I do have
The problem with this, don't you, from your own personal history?
yes,
Let's
I
lay
have
that
my
on
own
the
issue here
table.
because I am learning disabled, and as I've said before in this podcast, and I've had double time on all of these exams. And if I didn't have that extra time, I wouldn't be here. Um, so honestly, I'm certainly somebody who wouldn't be practicing medicine if I had to, if it was based on how I do under normal testing conditions, which, by the way, is all that most people get. And we've talked about that on some of our other shows. But the point is, to me, that's a very impoverished idea of what the gold standard is for choosing a physician. From a legal standpoint, and I'm not an attorney here, but even when the Supreme Court had its ruling on student for fair admissions case, the Supreme Court did not, as far as I know, say anything about how test scores should be the same across racial and ethnic groups in order to document that there's no bias. In fact, they even did acknowledge that, for instance, students could bring race into the admission process if they, in their essays, for instance, wrote about how it had been central to their development and what they might contribute. But in any case, I think
Yeah.
the point here is that I'm not aware that there's a legal requirement that test scores be the same. But as I said, the idea that that would be the thing that you would consider the gold standard measure is bizarre. The other point I want to make here, and I think I'm going a little bit off on a tangent, but I do feel I need to say this, is
Let's
that,
give it a chance.
yeah, so let's just talk about racial disparities in this country. The color of your skin, being black versus white, has somewhere between a 7 and a 10-fold impact on your wealth. And
Family wealth.
that's incredibly shameful. I mean, as a country, we should be deeply, deeply shamed. So the fact that people are sitting here and parsing Talmudically words like diversity and stuff like that in these documents, for God forbid, for the possibility that maybe a medical school is trying to mitigate some of those inequities, those gross inequities, those shocking inequities in some very small way, that God forbid they should be doing that. We need to nail them. I mean, to me, that is very disturbing. Now, I mean, they may be, but it's certainly not in the LCME document. In fact, I think we could have a separate conversation about whether medical schools are attempting as best as possible, at least some of them, to increase diversity that includes racial diversity. And
Yeah.
yeah, and personally, I hope they are, but that's not what we're discussing today. What we're discussing today is whether the LCME or these accreditation documents are about that, and I just don't see it. I just don't see it.
Let me try this on for size. So I checked in with people I know who deal with credentialing processes in schools, residencies. They say, yeah, we are asked about this. We're asked if over the last 5 to 10 years, we've been asked, what steps have you taken to address or to enhance diversity? What steps have you taken to enhance the likelihood that people from diverse backgrounds, often racial minorities, ethnic minorities, can get into your medical school? So does asking those, and I think asking questions when it comes from a credentialing body is certainly perceived as a form of pressure, don't you think?
So what the LCME does, and they say they do this, and I've also experienced it, is they say, what have you decided to prioritize as a mission driven diversity goal? And so, for instance, if you say, well, we're really trying to make our place more accommodating for people with physical disabilities, and that's what we've been working on, then they would say, okay, have you been successful? What processes have you put in place to do that? And have you seen change over time? And that's basic. And they're very transparent about that. I mean, that's what this document says. And when you look at the commentary that they publish, that's what they do. Now, I realize there are skeptics out there who are going to say, oh, they may say that, they may put it in writing, but we know when they come, they're really going to be looking for,
Numbers. Show us the numbers.
We're going to see like, oh, we really want to know, like, what's happened? How come you haven't addressed, the racial disparities or whatnot? And what I can tell you is not only do they not do that, but there's a reason they don't do it. Because it would create a tremendous backlash. When I was senior associate dean of education, obviously I was very anxious about the LCME review. They're coming to look at my medical school, and they're going to be going through this document and seeing if we're compliant and everything. And we spend months and months going through all of these standards and making sure we've checked off every box. Yes, we have the right number of computers, and yes, we have all of our faculty who are teaching off-site have credentials at the medical school, et cetera, every little thing you can think of, right? And then what happens is after the visit, we get a letter saying, you were good here, 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 and then here, we've got a problem here. If all of a sudden they were going to be like, well, you didn't have enough African Americans in your medical school, or whatever it is, that wasn't like one of our self-stated diversity goals, they would be completely out of order. They would know. We'd come back to them and say, hey, like, that's not like, that wasn't one of the things in your standards, and they would have no leg to stand on. So I guess what I'm saying is that the process itself doesn't really allow for that. It wouldn't work because the medical school itself would just push right back. They can't just say, well, it wasn't in our standards, but we just added on. What the heck? We did it for you. They can't do that. So I guess what I'm saying is, I understand there are people out there who are very skeptical about this sort of thing, and I'm just giving you my personal experience, as well as sharing with you what's in the standards.
In background planning for this episode, I did speak to somebody who runs a residency program. Um, the individual said they didn't use test scores alone to decide who would make a good resident in their particular residency program. They felt that their team could do a better job by looking at the entire person. Now, by the way, this is often termed holistic review, and I have seen critical statements from the right that looking at an entire person can't possibly be good. It's just cover for racial preferences. That's what they would say. But the individual I spoke with said, look, I think I can identify a variety of things, ranging from their grades to their research experience to their life experience. And the test score is just one part of it. And frankly, I have taken white students with lower test scores when I felt they would make a better contribution to this program. And I just didn't allow the test score alone to drive how we look at what makes for a good resident in a residency. So I think that aligns with a perspective that test scores alone are probably not going to be a perfect way to figure out who's going to be an effective medical student or resident. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that there is this suspicion that's animating a portion of our society and animating this order that somehow quality is definable, discernible, and litigable in court based on test score differences.
Yeah, but I just have to, again, I have to emphasize that debate, which I think people are welcome to have, is not connected to what's in the accreditation process. As I said, medical schools outside of the accreditation process may have
all kinds of things.
All kinds of things they want to do. Their admissions committee may say, "Yeah, we want these are some goals we have," and they have. If you look at the section on that, you have to have clearly stated admissions policies and practices and so forth, and then you have to adhere to them. But there's and if a medical school is trying to increase a particular group, that is just, and you can debate that. You can say we think that's bad, we think that's wrong. It's just not in the accreditation documents. And I think that's really critical because, again, the reason we're having this conversation is that the president of the United States is going after the accreditors and saying that they're responsible for DEI, and it's just not factually true. And it's not in their documents, and it's just not part of the accreditation process. And other than the fact that they say, you guys pick your diversity mission, and then show us how you're doing, but that's not the same thing. It's different.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair distinction and again, I too read these standards carefully. I didn't see some of the more explosive accusations made by the president's order, by do no harm, substantiated. I think it's reasonable to acknowledge that there may be individual schools which have decided specifically to disobey a ruling of the Supreme Court that says that basically you can't admit on a quota system and you can't make race a plus factor in the admissions process. That's what they said. If you'll let me, I'd like to present the other argument that's made against interest in diversity at the medical school level. This relies again on a report from Do No Harm. And that report argues that the medical schools have politicized their curricula, which essentially attempted to insert ever larger amounts of political content into what they teach, and that this is going to poorly serve the American public. Is that something you've ever heard before, Saul?
Yeah, and I've heard it. And again, I want to emphasize that if they are doing that, and I think that's a huge if, it has nothing to do with the accreditors. The accreditors don't actually say what should be in your curriculum other than that you should cover organ systems, for instance. It's very broad. And if people don't believe me, they can just Google the standards and look at them. The reason for that is that there's been this deeply held practice in higher education that a curriculum belongs to a faculty, that each faculty of each medical school, and again, this is not unique to medical schools, has control over what its students learn, and that accreditors just make sure that they cover sort of broad area of topics. The other thing that they specify is that a medical school has to have a very explicit set of learning objectives and desired learning outcomes. And so you can't just say, hey, faculty, teach whatever you want this year. No, the faculty has to sit down, there has to be a committee, and they have to work out and make transparent exactly what their learning objectives are across the curriculum and within every course and so on and so forth. It's got to be very explicit. And then they have to teach those learning objectives, and then they have to assess whether those learning objectives have been achieved. And this is just the basic structure of any good curricular design. But the LCME doesn't tell them what that curriculum should be. So I think the point I want to make, though, is the debate about whether medical school curricula are getting politicized is it's important not to entangle that with this attack on the accreditors, because the accreditors are not actually involved in that.
Well, in case somebody wants to push back, there is one that sort of relates to cultural competence and health inequities, 7.6. This is right before medical ethics and right after societal problems. But it says that the faculty have to ensure that the curriculum helps students recognize and appropriately address, listen to this, biases in themselves, in others, and in the healthcare delivery process. So there's a suggestion that a student might have a bias and that they might have to recognize it, and that they might need to be able to address that. Now, I guess, is that a political demand on the schools? Is that fighting words there?
So I would certainly hope that those who have concerns about specific biases would actually endorse having that in the curriculum, because the whole point of that directive is that we should talk about bias. We should talk about the fact that all people have bias, physicians have bias, and that we need to be aware of the way in which those biases affect the way in which we make decisions as health professionals. In fact, that's a whole subfield of cognitive psychology, as you, of course, are aware.
Yeah.
Is
Now, in case it's, this might be beating a dead horse, but I'm not sure the horse is dead. So I did find a report, again, purporting to be a study, suggesting that medical schools have politicized their curriculum. But what turned out to be the report and study documenting that was itself the most political exercise I've ever seen on the matter. And I just want to mention it. In a study published on the Do No Harm website, a investigator of some kind chose 8 words that they felt were truly non-biased scientific medical words that they hoped to see more of. And of course, catalogs, those included the words chemistry, anatomy, and Hippocratic. Then they also chose 8 words that they believe are always politicized whenever they're mentioned in a medical curriculum. Those included the words social and inclusion and justice. And they essentially did a word search on the course catalogs across a bunch of medical schools. And they found that given that they had chosen these 8 words that they thought were scholarly, like Hippocratic, and they had chosen 8 words they were sure were not scholarly, like social, the not scholarly words appeared more than the scholarly words. And on this basis, they concluded that the medical curriculum of all these medical schools were warped by politics. Nearly fell out of my chair with how rancidly political this exercise itself was. Who in their right mind would have thought that a word search on a course catalogs would be the best way to figure out what schools teach? But if you're going to do word searches, I noticed that among the words they didn't even look for were diagnosis or therapy or treatment or drugs. I mean, the things we actually teach most of the time in medical schools. But they're sure that the word Hippocratic should be on our lips every day when we're on rounds. And if it's not there in the course catalogs, in every single course, this must be a terribly warped medical school. This so-called study was presented as a study on the Do No Harm website. It is so obviously just a plain old political exercise. It exemplifies precisely the kind of political infusion draped in scholarly language that the president's order accuses medical schools and residencies of engaging in without much substance. I think it's really important for people who may not be doing medical education to understand when these accusations are made, they're very often layered by pseudoscientific political BS. And that was a perfect example.
Yeah, I think this actually might be a good time to talk a little bit about the journal side of this, because
Yes, there's an inquiry on medical journals from a U.S. attorney. Let's talk about that.
yeah, and the reason I bring that up is, you were just giving an example of, I think, what you see and I see as very, very poor science, right? If you're trying to study a medical school, to say that, we look at the ratio between how often they say the word Hippocrates or anatomy versus how often they say the word social. And if they say social more than they say Hippocrates, then they're
It's
biased.
obviously not
Right. Now,
scientific.
we know that is junk science, right? And similarly, and again, this is where I want to quote our current Health and Human Services Secretary, RFK Jr. And now I'm turning to an article in the New York Times where it says, Mr. Kennedy has been nursing grievances about scientific journals for years. Medical and science publishers have long rejected article submissions that purport to show a link between vaccine and autism. And again, that's because they haven't been publishable. But to him, it's more a sign that there's something wrong with the journals.
Yeah.
Similarly, it may be that the article that you saw on the website of Do No Harm has not been successfully published, not because the journals suck, but because maybe the science sucks. RFK, and again, I'm quoting the New York Times here, said on a podcast last year that he would seek to prosecute medical journals under the federal anti-corruption statute. He said, quote, I'm going to litigate against you under the racketeering laws, under the general tort laws. I'm going to find a way to sue you unless you come up with a plan right now to show how you're going to start publishing real science and stop retracting the real science and publishing the fake pharmaceutical science by these phony industry mercenaries. So that's RFK Jr., who is angry that our eminent journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine, are not publishing what he thinks is the good science, and instead are publishing what he thinks is junk science.
We're turning to an inquiry on medical journals from a U.S. attorney from the District of Columbia, Edward Martin. He was essentially a political activist, never actually had worked as a prosecutor, but he does have a law degree, and he was appointed for now to serve as U.S. attorney in one district. And he's issued a set of letters to medical journals, making a demand of them, making an argument to them, and issuing a kind of threat regarding their objectivity. I'm looking at the letter that was sent to the editor-in-chief of Chest Journal. That would be for experts in pulmonary medicine and thoracic surgery. And he writes to say that he is seeking information. He says more and more journals and publications like Chest Journal are conceding that they are partisans in various scientific debates. That is, that they have a position for which they are advocating. The questions asked of this particular journal are, how do you assess your responsibilities to protect the public from misinformation? How do you clearly articulate to the public when you have certain viewpoints that are influenced by your ongoing relations with supporters, funders, advertisers, and others? Do you accept articles or essays from competing viewpoints? How do you assess the role played by government officials and funding organizations like National Institutes of Health in the development of submitted articles? How do you handle allegations that authors of works in your journals may have misled their readers? So those are a series of questions that would seem to be focused on bias and control of conflict of interest. And those are natural questions in my mind, but it's odd that it comes from a U.S. attorney. As I understand it, Saul, these went to more than just one journal. Is that right?
Yeah, and most recently, the New England Journal also received this letter or something similar.
I guess the first question is it wrong to ask how a journal protects the public from misinformation?
So again, I think we have to put this in context. In both the executive order going after the accreditors and in this letter that is sent to these journals is obviously a threat. And the threat here is that the government is going to use its power to harm
Journal.
the journal. The ways in which you can do that, obviously, I'm not an expert, but you could certainly, for instance, take away their not-for-profit status. And obviously with accreditors, the effect is much more dire. You can literally get rid of them. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I think that these two things are part and parcel of the same things, right? They're attacks. It's weaponization of the federal government against civil institutions. And that's why I keep coming back to Maria Ressa, to Jason Stanley, to Tim Snyder, and saying that
these are scholars
these
of
are scholars of
totalitarianism and fascism.
authoritarianism. And I think it's so important. And we've been, I think, rightfully getting into the weeds here to talk, to take what the critics say seriously. But it's so important to pull back and just say, hey, guys, let's not be a chump. And be fooled into thinking that these are serious debates to be taken at face value. Now, if you look at the larger picture and at people who look at the authoritarian playbook, these types of attacks on civil society, which basically go for wedge issues, go for areas where there are legitimate debates, and then use that to foment essentially a breakdown of the normal functioning of civil society is the goal. We are supposed to be a society where there is noisy discourse. I have no problem with any group in civil society raising concerns, questions about the functioning of civil society, whether they're looking at the accreditation process or the way in which our journals vet articles. That's the cacophony of democracy. It's when the government steps in and starts to use its power in a way that weaponizes it against these entities that it becomes the authoritarian's playbook. And again, that's what we have to keep coming back to. In our last episode, we were talking about the attack on law firms, and we were talking about the attack on Columbia and Harvard. And now here we are talking about how this has started to metastasize into other areas as well. And we kind of predicted that it was going to do that. One thing that's been very encouraging since our last episode is that one major institution, Harvard University, has stepped up and started to push back. And I think that's something we need to talk about here, because I think the medical profession has to start to push back. One thing that I'll say is I was talking with a colleague about this most recent executive order. And I was saying, I think just as university presidents have started to rally, as many of our listeners may know, university presidents have been signing a document. Now, hundreds of them have signed a document in the last few days, basically all taking a common position, pushing back against the government's overreach. And that started after one university stood up and basically the government blinked. And Maria Ressa said that. She said the only thing you can do is resist. And if you resist early on, you have the best chance. And the government wants you to think that it's powerful authoritarian takeover is inevitable, but it isn't. It isn't at this point. And you have to stand up. And, one of the things that struck me is when I was talking with a colleague about the most recent executive order against the accreditors, ACGME and LCME, and I was saying that I think the deans need to rally in the same way that university presidents have rallied, medical school deans to rally. And my colleague said, I think that's going to be tough because a lot of them really don't like the LCME. There's a lot of bitterness towards the LCME. There are a lot of problems, with the LCME. And so my response to that was there is going to be, contentious debate around any accreditor. And, that's the nature, again, of a democratic society where people take positions and they argue about it and so forth. But here's the thing. If that keeps medical schools and deans from rallying around to save the accreditation process, they are going to regret it, I think, greatly if that accreditation process is destroyed.
Yeah, let's play that out.
I think that's the key point here. You don't have to agree with the status quo to stand up for and when I say the status quo, you don't have to say there's no anti-Semitism at Columbia. You don't have to say that the LCME is perfect. You don't have to say any of those things to say that we want to preserve a democratic civil society. And we're not going to let this cacophony of disagreement be used as a tool to divide us, to allow an authoritarian takeover. And I think that's really the key point that I think that I certainly would like to emphasize, that I think is what Maria Ressa is getting at.
So let's play out what the threat seems to be. The idea would be that there's an organization that currently certifies medical schools and another one that certifies medical residencies, that these organizations would be investigated, and they would either have to alter their standards in a way that removes all mention of any contentious topic that the government doesn't want mentioned.
Let me just pause right there, because that's the claim, right? But what we've seen over and over again, and we saw this with Columbia, is that when the institution tries to acquiesce and say, okay, we'll make the changes you want, do we see the government pull back? Of course we don't, because that was never their intention in the first place. And so, that I think is the key point. So if the ACGME said, oh yeah, we have diversity, the word is here in 5 places,
we'll just remove it,
and then you'll leave us alone, right? Of course not. And I think Maria Ressa's point, and Jason Stanley's point and Tim Snyder's point, all these experts of authoritarians, they say, no, you have to resist. You have to say, back off. There are processes, there are absolutely processes in place for raising concerns about any of these issues. If you're concerned about discrimination, there are ways in which you can open up formal investigations. All of those things are in place. But the process that's occurring right now, where these executive orders are being released and there's an all-out assault and they're saying we're going to take away all your NIH funding, or we're going to discredit you, or we're going to take away your not-for-profit status, this is not in good faith. And I think it's really important for people to remember that.
Well, point taken, but let's assume that they remove the certifying authority of these bodies. They somehow very quickly stand up new organizations that are prepared to evaluate the entirety of the function of 100 and some odd medical schools in the United States. I'm wondering a lot about what the administration would look for in an organization that could rapidly stand up to somehow evaluate medical schools. What do we think this administration will be looking for to decide if a medical school is a good one? And how are they going to choose all the experts to evaluate how medical schools run?
Yeah, it's such an important question. So, what happens if you get rid of the LCME and the ACGME? And by the way, a residency program has to be accredited by the ACGME in order for it to get Medicare dollars or federal dollars to pay the stipends. A residency program can't get funding to pay its residents from the federal government if it's not accredited by the ACGME currently. Okay, and for the LCME, it's a little bit different, but my understanding is that you have to graduate from an LCME accredited medical school to go through the licensure process. So I think the point is that accreditation is currently incredibly important, and if the federal government is successful at getting rid of these two entities and replacing it by basically, quote unquote, inviting others to be fast tracked to replace them, I think it's not hard to imagine what the disadvantages of that would be. I mean, look at what they actually asked of Harvard, right? They didn't just ask of Harvard, could you please address your anti-Semitism issues? No. If you actually read the letter that went to Harvard, it was a complete takeover. They basically said, we want to be able to monitor viewpoint diversity for every faculty hire, and we want to be able to do audits, and it just went on and on. And so, that's essentially completely taking away academic freedom. And similarly, if they are targeting medical education and residency program, I have no reason to think that they have a different agenda. And by the way, there may also be a fair amount of dealing going on. Who knows? Who knows what they'll do? But I think that the key here for any dean who is saying, heck, I'm not going to defend the LCME because, boy, they were horrible when they came and evaluated us. It was really tough. I mean, I think they should really think twice about saying, I'd rather just see what happens if they're just eliminated and replaced by something that the Trump administration would like to see. And I would urge them to look critically at, for example, what the Trump administration has been trying to do to, say, as I was saying, to universities like Harvard or Columbia, which is much more of a takeover and a devastating attack on academic freedom.
I want to return to the fact that there probably are people who heard some of the arguments early on but want to come back to them, which is that within academic medicine, there are trends and fashions. I feel like I've seen, looking at the perspective section of the New England Journal of Medicine, a kind of takeover of mostly left-leaning or progressive viewpoints. I haven't seen any conservatively origined articles in that perspective section much at all for the last 5 years. I think it's pretty important for us to say that we would be agreeable, or that I personally enjoy and want arguments about those fashions and those trend lines and push back on them. Is that a fair concern?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to point out that when RFK Jr. attacks these journals, it's not because he's unhappy with the little viewpoint column or perspective column, which tends to be like one or a few pages of a journal. And then often journals don't have any of these perspective pieces. Most of these journals are overwhelmingly scientific forums for publishing peer-reviewed research. And when RFK Jr. is complaining, he's not complaining about the fact that the perspective piece wasn't to his liking. He's complaining about the fact that they won't publish his fake autism studies. And that's why he's going after them. I mean, that's what he's saying. And so I think it's important to understand that when they talk about viewpoint diversity, they're not just talking about somebody's opinion on a social issue that's published as a perspective piece. He's talking more fundamentally about science. And so obviously we don't want science journals to publish junk science. That is just that's just not the viewpoint that we ever want to accept. So I think I think that's what he's getting at when he talks about viewpoint diversity. Now, of course, I agree with you that if you're going to have a column in your journal, and some journals do have columns, many don't. I don't know if Chess does, but the New England Journal has a column where they, discuss
They offer
issues,
3 to 5 viewpoints.
having to do with health insurance or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I think sure if you feel like the viewpoints are too politically slanted in one direction or another. I don't know. That's something that we debate in a free society, but that's certainly not a basis for the federal government weaponizing its powers to go and destroy the journal. And again, I keep coming back to the authoritarian playbook. We need to understand
Yeah.
that this is an assault on everything. It's an assault on civil society. It's an attempt to destroy academia. It's an attempt to destroy the academic enterprise. It's intended to destroy the functioning and operating of the medical education, along with other educational systems. It's just an assault on all of that. And I was looking at actually an editorial in Lancet that just came out a couple days ago, written by the editor-in-chief of Lancet, Richard Horton, and it's called "Supporting Medical Science in the USA." And he writes that one of the intents of authoritarian governments is to destroy independent science at government institutions and to silence academia. Science becomes a tool of state-sponsored propaganda. He then goes on to talk about, quote, the harassment of journals comes amid wider radical dismantling of the USA's scientific infrastructure. He goes on to say that, quote, science and medicine in the USA are being violently dismembered while the world watches. While the risks to civil servants and academics' livelihoods are real and understandably frightening, bullies are only emboldened by acquiescence or indifference. And I thought this was particularly important to share because this is coming from somebody outside of the United States. It's basically a concerned spectator, a renowned journal editor who is sitting there watching all this happening and is seeing the big picture and is seeing this, as he describes it, as basically an all-out attempt to dismember, is the word he uses, the entire enterprise of science and medicine. And I think we have to set aside our quibbles. We can't be tricked into thinking that if we take, Trump's side, that's going to advance, our particular concern about diversity issues and whatnot. I think that's the big point here. Those are important debates, but don't confound them with the rank destruction that is occurring in our midst.
Yeah, unfortunately, at least at the moment, my perception is that what the attack on a credentialing of schools reflects is what you say, that there's an institution. It has a process to evaluate schools, medical schools, residencies. Taking it down and making it dependent on one political party would be a bad thing. I would see that as similar to the attack on the universities at this time. I'm very cognizant, and I just want to underscore this, that there is a big complaint, and I've said it multiple times in this episode, that the institutions that we are seeking to defend have a left-leaning bias or a liberal bias, and that in some sense for many people, what this looks like is merely a correction to a bias that was there before. However, I think the correction they seek may wind up being one in which all of us have a lot less freedom to think, to speak, to write, and to argue going forward than we've had in the past. And I would much rather have even the people who don't agree with what we say writing, posting on X that we're full of it and saying that they want to correct our misunderstandings than them saying, you know what, let's just take down universities, let's just take down medical journals, and let's determine what they publish and what they teach.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons democracies are so rare and are so fragile is because they are very easy to destroy. And that's because a healthy democracy is a place of disagreement. It's a place where people are fighting all the time, but they're doing it in a setting where the where the government is not using its power, weaponize its tools against civil society. It's a place where, and by the way, I just have to say, democracy in America has been extremely imperfect. And I think it goes without saying. But to the extent that we have been a democracy, and I think we've been seen, and rightly so, as being a democratic society, we create a place for healthy disagreement and debate. And I think what we have to understand now is that is being used as a cudgel to foment division, and then ultimately that becomes the path to creating the destruction of the democratic enterprise and an authoritarian takeover. And this is, as I said, this is just something that people who study this see over and over again. And we need to not be chumps. We need to not fall for it. I think that's really the key point. I want to just share a few recommendations because after our last episode, I did get some emails saying, thank you for that episode, but can you be more specific about things you would recommend? And by the way, I think listeners may have better ideas than we do, but I just want to share a few thoughts. So first of all, most of us belong to professional associations that are, so whether we're specialists or generalists, or even if we're not physicians, we may belong to educational organizations for health professions. And I think it's time for organizations to step up, to take positions on this, and to work together. One suggestion would be to create an emergency committee where members can voluntarily agree to be on that committee, and you get together and you say, okay, the latest thing that's happened in the last week is the president is going after the LCME and the ACGME. What are we going to do about it? Whatever it is, the question is what kind of statement are we going to put out, and how are we going to speak up and push back? And I think that the stakes are high because these organizations are afraid, of course, that if they speak up, that maybe they're going to get attacked. Mm-hmm. But what I would say is you're going to get attacked anyway. If you look at what's happened, no one can hide. The LCME and the ACGME were not putting out provocative statements. The government came looking for them. The American Public Health Association has spoken up. They've been very vocal. And if you go to their website saying this isn't right, it's dangerous and so forth. And, when I saw that, I joined the American Public Health Association because that's where I want to put my membership dues, and I want to be a part of that. And similarly, if other organizations I belong to are not interested in stepping up and they want to kind of lay low, well, my interest in being a part of those organizations is going to diminish because I think this is the crisis of our time. And I think as physicians, we have to be very strong stewards of the profession. And, if we don't have a system of medical education that has standards and that becomes intensely corrupted and controlled by a government with an authoritarian agenda, that is not going to be in the service of a healing profession. So I think, at least certainly in my opinion, so I think that's there's a direct line between what we care about in our day-to-day work and these issues. So that's one thing. And I think our organizations can play a role. I think leaders have to step up. Just as university presidents are now stepping up, I think medical school deans should step up, and other people in comparable positions. I think that
those of us who have tenure can speak.
Yeah.
Those if you're a medical school professor with tenure, you should be able to speak.
Yeah. I was listening to Joseph Stiglitz, who is a renowned Nobel Prize winning economist, speaking literally on the lawn of Columbia a couple days ago. I watched it on YouTube, and he's not young; he's quite old at this point, and he was out there, and he was saying, those of us who have tenure have an obligation to speak up. We're not perfectly safe, but we're safer, and we need to speak up about what's happening right now. It's too important. So I do think that those of us who have power need to use that power. And again, I feel a real sense of pressure when I listen to people like Maria Ressa and VDEM saying, you have weeks, maybe months before it's too late. And so I think that, and I also take heart in seeing what happened when, say, Harvard stood up and how that rallied hundreds of university presidents. And now the government is starting to backtrack. So I think that there is a real payoff to standing up. And as Maria Ressa says, once you give up a freedom, you will not get it back.
At least not for a good long time.
Not for a good long time.
I think that's a helpful place to close on. And I just want to again underscore that we are open to the dialogue, the discussion, the debate, and the criticisms of the institutions that exist in our society today. But I share the concern that replacing or attempting to take down every major organization that's not tied to a political party is going to be dangerous for all of us. And I appreciate the chance to have this conversation with you, Saul.
Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.